Welcome back, everybody. I hope you were able to get something to eat, replenish yourselves, and you are back to take us down through the home stretch for the last half of Jam Day 2. I'm really excited about this next session. This is a session called Revitalizing Voices, Preserving Indigenous Languages Through Post-Secondary Education. We pre-record a number of our sessions due to availability and to confirm technology, and this session was recorded last week where we brought together our panelists to discuss the issue of preserving Indigenous languages within post-secondary institutions. This was a really rich conversation, and I found myself reflecting a fair bit about this conversation after it was concluded. This panel explores some of the challenges of preserving Indigenous languages. It discusses the role that post-secondary institutions can play to help maintain fluency for Indigenous languages. And I think you'll find this is a very worthwhile session to be a part of. Our panelists will be joining us at the end to take your questions. So as always, please make sure you put your questions into the chat, and we're going to take it away over to video right now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this session titled Revitalizing Voices, Preserving Indigenous Languages Through Post-Secondary Education. When BC-CAT is putting together the agenda for JAM, we often like to listen to what we're hearing at articulation committees, at sector level meetings, as well as at our council to come up with content that we feel will be of interest to our audience here at JAM. And this topic was particularly relevant and brought up by John Chenoweth, who is a member of our council, who spoke to our council at a recent meeting about the importance of Indigenous languages and how they are at risk of disappearing given the current age of elders, the number of people who are fluent in the language, and the availability of speakers to maintain fluency and teach that fluency in post-secondary institutions. And so we thought that this would be quite an interesting topic to bring together a variety of perspectives on, to talk a little bit more about how Indigenous languages can be preserved and what role post-secondary institutions can play in this regard. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. First, I'd like to introduce Dianne Biin, who is the Director of Indigenous Education and Engagement from Selkirk College. We have Jason La Rochelle, Director of the Office of Indigenization at JIBC. We have Dr. John Chenoweth, who is the President of Nicola Valley Institute of Technology. And we have Miranda Huron, who's the Director of Indigenous Education and Affairs from Capilano University. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, now just a reminder to our viewers, we will be taking questions. Our panelists will be standing by live to take your questions from the audience. So if you'd like to put any comments or questions, please do so in the chat below, and we'll be relaying them to our panelists at the end of this session when we switch over to the live portion. So I thought I'd kick things off with a question for you, John, since you were the one that brought it up at our council meeting. Why is Indigenous language revitalization such an urgent priority, and what role do you think post-secondary institutions play in this work?
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. And I just want to say greetings to our fellow panelists here. It is very important. Maybe I can speak to something that just happened just in the last week here. We lost one of our language teachers, beloved knowledge keeper, elder in the community, and he's gone, and his knowledge is gone. The students that had that instructor are quite upset, and as is the community, but I mean, they know he's in a better place right now, but the needs of preserving our languages is being diminished by elders being gone and just passing on. So it's something that it's becoming quite vital right now. And so with that, if you think about all of us as public institutions, and you think about the TRC and the calls to action, I believe as public institutions, we have a responsibility to do whatever we can to support our communities with language revitalization and fluency and anything that we can do to truly address TRC with the communities we serve. And so as in terms of an importance for for us, even within the council, like the BC Cat. I know that articulation and recognition of languages within our system is critical to ensuring that the funding mechanisms that fund students, they have accredited programs, and the need exists within our communities right across the country, and there are policies in place with the federal government about not supporting students in non-credited programs. So I think for us as in our roles within our institutions, but also within BC CAT, is how do we support Indigenous communities to have accredited programming to revitalize languages and not be blocked by policies that may not allow it. So it's very important. It's close to all of our hearts, and that's why I would have said that at the council meeting, Mike.
Thanks, John. I wonder if any of the other panelists would like to weigh in on John's comments there. And I'm sorry to hear about the loss of the elder, John. Thanks for letting us.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah.
Dianne, do you want to offer any reflections on the importance of language revitalization at your institution?
Yeah, it's such a hard space to hold. And it's a hard space to hold because the amount of grief and trauma of not being able to speak our languages freely is definitely still a hurt that stings. And I know for some of the elders and for some of the knowledge keepers as well, it was always, when we speak our words, it's who we are and it's how we reflect ourselves. And it's hard to get into that good space again. And I think within an public institution, we need to strive to ensure that we're creating a culturally safe space so that those instances of relearning and hearing the stories of why the languages aren't spoken as well as they used to be, still those truths still need to be heard. When that is broached, then the learning can begin, and then the retention continues, and then the work that our languages do to give us space and being and place within the territories really starts to gain strength again. And as a public institution, it's our responsibility to ensure that those voices and those perspectives are heard, and those voices are heard within the traditional languages, that it's not all English-based, translatory type of transactional, that a lot of the knowledges that are held in the languages have a hard time being translated into English because some of the English language is very limiting on a term, gives you an entire worldview and protocol and practice and law in that one term that's not translatable well into English and into different worldviews. So that, I think, is the ability for post-secondaries, is to really open up those different ways of knowing and being, and to acknowledge that they are different and that they are that they're unique and that they're special and that they're beautiful.
Thank you, Dianne. I wonder if Miranda or Jason, if you'd like to offer any reflections as well. Miranda?
Sorry, I was waiting on Jason. No, within this world, I mean, John has it so right with putting the community first, and it's such a hard step for institutions to do, to understand, to come at with the humility that they need to in doing this work, because the communities will have a different approach to education than institutions. And when I look at the work that that's being done out there, and that ability to have language nests and have speakers come forward and teach in a way that hits the soul of the student versus the various styles of academically oriented learning that may not actually translate into fluency. It's a space for really creative education, and a lot of the processes that we have in place at post-secondary institutions don't necessarily align with that work, and that's change that we need to do. And I know that, here at CAP, we partner in with Lilwat and with Shishaf Nation in language education programming. And it's a constant challenge of how do we make this really work well. And with working with the Tazeel Learning Center is a great learning opportunity for us as an institution, because having an Indigenous lead in this program and us being there to help and support it's a great space, because then we can acknowledge that they are the head in this work, and we're just helpers along the way.
Right. Jason, do you want to offer any thoughts on the urgency of language revitalization at JIBC?
I mean, in terms of the question, I mean, John, Dianne, and Miranda have really covered it. I think one additional thing that I'd offer in terms of priority is, I've been part of like the Indigenous Articulation Committee for, I guess, about 10 years now. And it is something that, especially in the last few years, but even 10 years ago, but really more recently, it is a topic that continues to be brought to that table, and it's not always clear as a sector how we're handling language revitalization and how to best handle it as well. But the fact that it continues year after year to be a topic that burgeons each year and that we need to pay more attention to and focus on, I think kind of speaks to how much of a priority it is, but also continues to be, and that there is an urgency because it is very limited how many language speakers we can lean on, or that are even willing to be connected to post-secondary education as well.
Thanks, Jason. And I think that's a nice segue to the next question I have, which is, what are some of the key challenges faced by Indigenous communities and elders in sustaining language learning, and what role can post-secondary institutions play to help address them? I wonder if, Dianne, you wanted to start with that question.
Sure. There's so many challenges, I think, with communities, and John started it off in the right way. A lot of those fluent speakers are starting to leave us. And there are other communities that are still rediscovering their languages through different archival collections and from different museums that had our recordings done way back on the wax cylinders, and then all the way up to cassettes, and then CDs. So there's different technologies that we kind of have to train ourselves in first on how to access those technologies, and then to start to create the curriculum. A lot of the language learning that happens, you need that system, and for a lot of fluent speakers, they're fluent speakers first, they're teachers second. And having that ability for them to connect with one another and to really role model with one another on how to hold the classroom space is important. And so there's been some really nice work that Nowkin Center had done, where they make sure that they have a teacher working alongside one of the fluent speakers, and knowing that the fluent speaker will get fatigued, that they bring in those breaks, and that they do language learning in a different pace than you would say in a classroom where you have, a 2-hour and 50-minute block, and you have to get through lessons 1 till 10. And then you have to get tested on that, and then you have to do your group work on it. So there's different ways that have to be reconciled on how that language learning occurs. A lot of the communities have also spent a lot of time trying to figure through what the curriculum could look like and how it could be and what are the levels. You know, how does one move from a new speaker to becoming a competent speaker, to becoming a master? And what's that master apprentice mechanism that a lot of our post-secondaries don't really hold that type of leveling? And then how do you test that? And then what happens if someone fails that test, which is just horrific, because it's not you get an A+ on it or you get a D. It's really, how is your heart holding that language? And so there's different mechanisms that are there when you're doing assessment. And to know that the class, all the students in the classroom are not just students, they're also a community, and they're a community of learners. And so how does that community sustain itself? And how does that community uphold one another as they're going through the learning? So there's a lot of different challenges that communities, funding is always a big challenge. The ability to create a type of learning space that feels natural and not contrived. And I think some of the ways that post-secondaries can do this is just how we recognize the credentialism and the mastery of the language instructors who are coming in, and recognizing that their authority on who they designate as fluent speakers is their authority. It's not like we're looking for a credential, but it's those language authorities that are really guiding us. We're not the ones that are gatekeeping on credential to come in to teach. We're here to provide space so that that teaching can happen in a different way. And we're using different technologies, and how we do assessment is different. One of the language classes that we had here, their final exam, everyone was in the classroom together, they did the exam, and then they co-marked all of their papers amongst one another, because they were a community of learners. And so they were really spending time with the fluent speakers and with the instructors to really figure out the nuances, because there's so many dialectal differences in our languages that sometimes you may be wrong, but you're not. It just depends on where you come from and who you learn from. And that's what we realized. There's a annual conference that happens down in Spokane, and it's for all of the Salish language speakers. So that's from Idaho, Montana, Washington, Oregon, all the way up across the southern part of BC. And all of them, when they start to speak about what they know, they always acknowledge all of their previous teachers that they had learned the language from. And then so right away, you know what community they're from, what dialect they're speaking from, and how and who they learn from, which is a different way of credentialism than what's typical in a post-secondary.
Really appreciate that, Dianne, and that's amazing. And I love the way you described about how do you hold the language in your heart. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Do any of the others want to weigh in on some of the challenges that you have experienced or faced by Indigenous communities in maintaining languages?
Sure. I know that Diane's absolutely right that our language teachers are also our resource center. They're the bookstore. They're the they're the Coles Notes to everything. And funny enough, I know going back when we first started doing language training, we threw a fluent speaker in a classroom, and it was basically have fun. And there's a course outline, things like that we're kind of creating on the fly. So I think we've grown a lot in the last maybe 30 years around that. But one point I want to make is a lot of communities want to learn language. They don't care about credit. And for me, it's shocking. I'm like, what? You don't want 3 credits or a certificate? No, I want to learn my language, right? And so I had to really take a step back personally as an educator to go, okay, it's not about maybe credentialing all the time. It's about your identity and how important that is. And I think about our elders who are our first teachers. There's many models out there, and the communities that we work with, all of them have an elder as the source in the classroom. And they also have like I'll call them young whippersnappers that have graduate degrees that want to learn their language, that are learning as they're teaching. And this is all like we're working on a plane as it's flying, right? And semester through semester. So that's something that all the schools should take note of. Is there's lots of different ways to get this done. The fact is that you're just doing it, and the elders play such a critical role in that. And I think it's time that we as public schools um, pay a little homage to, there's a quote by, I don't know if you guys know, Gregory Kahedi. He's an Indigenous scholar down south. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's basically like these stories, this language, these ways in this land are the only things I can leave for you. Well, that's our elders telling us. That's all I have is my knowledge of the land, my knowledge of the language, and our ways, our protocols. But there's teaching in them for those who want to learn. And I think it's time that us, as public education, we need to go to those elders and say, we want to learn. And now to do that, it's a leap of faith for a lot of public schools, because it's like, well, how do we do that? Right? How do we accredit a course? How do we put it in the transfer system? How do we create resources and all of that? And it's kind of scary. And then plus, how do we do it without money? Right? Because when you're looking at competing budgets, who knows how many people want to take the language there, but you have a community that might want it. How do you fund that? How do you find resources? Communities are very resourceful. There's a lot of language funding out there. I'm kind of glad that most of that funding is targeted to the communities so that they're in charge. They're driving the bus. And I think it's just really important that we as publics are very respectful to them and say, how can we help? What do you need from us? And because that's our business. That's what we do best, is how can we help you so that your students can get credits, those that want that. But thanks, Dianne. That's great points.
Thanks, Dianne and John. I wonder, this is a good segue to talk about successful partnerships that might be able to be used as examples when it comes to supporting language learning and revitalization. Miranda, I wonder if you might have any examples that you might be able to share of some successful partnerships that you're aware of, and could they be a model for other institutions to emulate?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, there's so much great work happening out there. Every time I turn around, I'm running into language groups and feeling inspired. I do know that within BC, one of the things that's going on that's really interesting is the conversations, and we've had conversations with at CAP with First Peoples Cultural Council, and trying to get that prior learning assessment happening with programs that they're aware of, so that we can just say, yes, you've done your language accreditation because First Peoples has gotten the community acknowledgement that this is a language program. And so those sort of partnerships are really key to stepping through some of the bureaucratic hurdles that we tend to create at these institutions. John, I obviously have to mention your partnership with UBCO and the Nicola language program and Jeanette Armstrong. I mean, my goodness. Call to Action 16, being responded to directly, actually creating a bachelor's program around language education, and the fluency that's coming out of there. Unbelievable. SFU and the program with Swoltwo, the Tomstila Tisnuchum. I'm sorry about pronunciation. With the partnership with SFU and Squamish Nation, where they can have the SFU certificate or diploma, but they're also learning fluency. They came over here when we were doing our canoe ceremony, and the ceremony was happening in the language, and it was just so beautiful to see these students learning and being part of it. And even last week I was on the boat to Alert Bay, and there was an entire language course for Kwakwaka'wakw going over to the Omista Museum, and they sat around and they were doing a tour and finding language patterns and creating language learning as they were going. So they're going around in English, finding language patterns, turning that into a lesson in situ so that they could do cultural center tours in the traditional language with the students doing these events. And so like that work with the students to get creative around how they learn. And even recently, just that openness in master's degrees. There was, and I can't remember the student now, but they had done their master's degree in carving in their language. So finding those very specific parts of language, the ones that get lost the most easily. What is the name of this tool? What is the sound that it makes when it's going through? All of these things which Dianne had spoken to earlier, were the magic of the languages that doesn't get found anywhere else. Creating space for students to do their master's programs in their traditional language so that they're bringing that language back into life and breathing it out there into the world. Fantastic.
Thanks, Miranda. I wonder if Jason or Dianne, do you know of any other examples that you would put forward as successful partnerships in terms of language revitalization, in addition to the ones that Miranda just listed? It's okay if you don't, no problem.
Hey, Mike.
I was
ahead,
just
Dianne.
thinking about one of my cousins back home who's actually a elementary school teacher. And she put in a proposal to teach the language, not in the classroom, but on horseback on the land. Because that's how she learned the language.
Yeah, it's
So,
wonderful. You
ways.
kind of using the land as your classroom is brilliant. And I also just want to mention too, there's a lot of colleges using dual credit with language. I think that's a wonderful model to use.
Excellent. Why don't we pivot to everybody's favorite topic, policies? And I'm going to direct this question to you, Jason. I wonder about what policies or institutional commitments are necessary to embed language revitalization into the core of post-secondary education. Right now, many Indigenous languages are not required as part of degree programs. And so I wonder if there is, if you have any ideas on certain policy shifts or commitments institutions should make to make this a priority.
Yeah, I think and I'm going to focus a bit on the commitments portion, because I think the institutional commitments can help inform policy or drive policy or inform direction as well. I suppose a starting point for any institution is to look at a high level at like strategic plans or Indigenous strategies, and what kinds of Indigenous specific commitments does the institution make that are built into the high level plans. See if language revitalization is mentioned in any way, but also see if not, which wouldn't be uncommon. I think thinking about those large scale commitments, where does language revitalization fit in, right? Because it's not always a direct path, as we've found out. And so sometimes I think there's broad enough language to really kind of think about how that institution can help support language revitalization. I think that does lead to, and some of the examples that have already been shared are good examples of post-secondary institutions and partnerships with Indigenous communities. And I think an important commitment for the institution is really formalizing that, getting to a formalized way. So like an MOU, for instance. I think the benefit of having it documented, institutions like to document things, right? So using it in for the good of the community, it's a way regardless of what that document looks like, MOU or otherwise, is there's an accountability to that commitment that's built in as well, and an actual, statement of intention to work together to help support, and however that's going to look. So a commitment to fostering relationships with Indigenous communities, and funding was mentioned earlier as well. And I think post-secondary institutions and the nature of the funding, but also the nature of funding different initiatives that are based on those commitments can also help be built in. As John mentioned, there's a lot of community-based funding, which I think is great and should be based in the communities. Sometimes those necessitate partnerships with post-secondary institutions as well. So it's an opportunity for post-secondary institutions to step up in those partnerships and help support language revitalization. And so, like I mentioned, these kinds of commitments can help drive policy. But in working with the communities, it would also be good, rather than post-secondary institutions presuming that they have all the policies in place or that they need certain policies, is to work with those communities and specifically the language speakers to find out what are their needs, what are potentially policies that they've come across from institutions that have been barriers in the past, or where they've seen gaps where policy could be created that will actually help foster that relationship and partnership and push that forward. And like John mentioned, not everyone is looking for a credential at the same time, because this does come up at our articulation tables, and especially in the Indigenous articulation realm. I think it is important to look at what kinds of articulation agreements, what kinds of transfer agreements, what's the student mobility for someone that's involved in language programming, whether it's an entire program or whether it's a course. What kind of recognition does that get, and what kind of transferability where there might be language requirements as well. So kind of that language fluency programs and what they might look like, and that credentialism, I think that's where post-secondary institutions do play a significant role and can help foster that language revitalization. Thanks.
Well said, and that's a nice segue into the next area that I wanted to ask about. Obviously, at BC-CAT, in our coordination of the BC transfer system, we're interested in transfer credit. And John, you mentioned a little bit earlier, a lot of times people aren't even seeking transfer credit; they just want to learn the language. I wonder, though, if there are ways that the BC transfer system could better support Indigenous language course transferability, as well as additional program pathways. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great point. Even I'm out here in Eastern Canada working with this National Association for Higher Learning, Indigenous organizations, and one of the biggest concerns they have nationally is articulation. And no different in BC, a lot of our communities have some incredible courses that they work with, and maybe they're not even courses, but they are teachings that they work with their communities on, and many of these are through the Ayala Institutes, right? Teaching their identities to their children, their young adults, and I think that one role we could play at BC-CAT is to, how do we support the accreditation of Indigenous knowledge born of communities and not having to be tied to us as a public. And I know that as publics, we're like, that's ours. We own the articulation process. And I believe from firsthand, you have to let it go. And firsthand wise, we work with Ayala right now, the Indigenous Adult Higher Learning Association. And believe it or not, we're like the UBC of the system. And communities want to have new courses, and we're like, what kind of course do you want to do, right? And we have to stop ourselves and say that community is the expert in their own identity and their own teachings. And so what do we have to do to support them? But how can they actually have their own accreditation, right? That would be a huge milestone nationally if we could come up with a solution to that. And there's probably many minds attending this conference that have ways and or ideas, and it's probably a really great idea if we start talking about it openly and within our own systems. The academic integrity aspect, the residency, all that is really strong, and in some ways, it, as Jason mentioned, it's kind of a hindrance sometimes to allowing communities to be recognized for the unbelievable, valuable gifts they can share. So that's, we need to find a way and do it quickly. So,
Jason, Dianne, Miranda, do you have any additional thoughts in terms of how the BC transfer system can support Indigenous language course transferability and recognition? Dianne?
I do. And I think the other side of the transfer part is ensuring that any Indigenous languages that are learned, not all students are going to be going towards the revitalization degree. They're also going to be doing other degrees and other graduate studies that require a language course as part of your credential. And having any Indigenous program or course that meets that would be fantastic. It's not only about French and Spanish. It can be about Insilchin, it can be Chilcotin, it could be Kwakwakiwak, it could be any Indigenous language. And so our work here at the college, we've really had an open dialogue with the Salish School of Spokane. They had created all of the course outlines. They had articulated it through their post-secondary systems. So it helped us articulate it through our EDCO. And their wish was that it wasn't an unassigned transfer credit, that it was recognized as on par with other language learning credits for any other program that's out there, be it engineering, nursing, whatever. And so that's what we've been striving to do in the transfer agreements, is to ensure that it's not an unassigned credit, that it is related to a language credit. And so we're starting to do that now with some of the other universities.
Jason or Miranda, would you like to weigh in?
Feel like it's well covered.
Okay. Well, I do have one final question, and this is for all of you, but we're going to start with you, Miranda. If you can make one call to action to post-secondary leaders and policymakers, what would it be with regards to language revitalization?
I mean, the biggest one for me is the relational roles. When we're looking at elders in the classroom, speakers in the classroom, and that we were almost creating a conflict with that teacher collective agreement, Indigenous people in the classroom who don't have the standard of accreditation that we're used to. And we need to sit down and really create space for allowing this to happen in a different way than the institution is used to, because it honestly, well, we don't have the time. We don't have the time to sit down and wait for all of these processes to catch up. I mean, we're not going to have elders doing their bachelor's and getting PhDs so that they can teach in the classroom. And there needs to be that acknowledgement of their importance in leading these pieces. I am going to give it a sneaky second and slightly coming off of what Dianne said earlier about the learning of all the archival pieces. Something else we have to deal with as post-secondaries is this concept of intellectual property with all of the academics who have come into territories and armchair academics who have come into territories and religions that have come into territories and taken languages, and they're stored in spaces that, nations have to go and find where where all of these recordings are. They have to get access. They're having to give ownership accreditation to people who've done the recordings versus people whose voices are on on those recordings or who've given the language that's documented in books, there has to be an external overview of how we're doing this. Unfortunately, intellectual property is based on proprietary economics versus understanding communal ownership. And as a nation, we need to sit there and really review that process.
Thanks, Miranda. Jason or Dianne, would you like to make a call to action to post-secondary leaders and policymakers?
Sure, I'm good to jump in there. I think having the discussion around language revitalization, because I think there are a number of institutions, and some of the examples that have been shared today that have clearly had those discussions at a more in-depth kind of level. But there are other institutions where it's in a much earlier stage and trying to figure out what this might look like. So, for instance, at JIBC, there isn't a natural, so to speak, kind of pathway around language revitalization, but that hasn't stopped us in having the discussion to figure out, especially from our elders and residents when they bring it up and talk about our learners and so forth. It's like, well, what might that eventually look like, right? So you have to have some of that conversation and invite that discussion at all levels of the institution, right? So bringing in those that you might not otherwise be thinking about, but when we're talking about those that are overseeing the policies, and even like presidents and VPs and AVPs and deans and so forth, being able to have those kinds of discussions and thinking about. So it's not just a pocket of the institution, right? That it is something that is being talked about throughout the institution. And then I think that'll ultimately benefit the Indigenous communities and the students that are looking to be involved in languages.
Thanks, Jason. Dianne or John, do you have any final words? Dianne?
I got two.
Okay.
Make sure that these Indigenous language courses are free for Indigenous students to take, and do that tuition waiver for them in order to do this. Two, go through your assessment policies and ensure that you have orality and alternative assessments built in so that those instructors who are coming in feel supported and encouraged to do this type of assessment in different ways, and that it's accepted by the institution.
Excellent. Love those. Love those. John?
Sure. Great points, everyone. Wonderful. Maybe one thing I'll just like to remind schools is that all the work done in Indigenous academia right now is done at the hands of people who either are descendants of or who are residential school survivors. And the responsibility that comes with for us as institutions is to say, you know what, they're people, the survivors or descendants of, are doing everything they can within our institutions to support communities. So it's that fascinating, and it's that dire, right? The work needs to be done. And maybe one of the points that I'd like to see schools do, and right up the alley with Dianne, what you just mentioned about no tuition, similar to the youth in care, right? And I know that a young lady from NVIT put forward a motion to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and it was passed. So that next step for that is to the province. So they're going to get that right between the eyes around. We want something similar. So that's one less barrier that we can remove to learn our languages. So that's what I'd like to tell our institutions now, Mike.
Appreciate that, John. We are at time. I really want to thank all of you for this excellent conversation. I thought this was really informative. You're all very well spoken. So thank you, John. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Dianne. Thank you, Jason. Just a reminder to our audience, we are going to be flipping over to the live session, so we will be able to take your questions. So please feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll take it from there. So thank you, everybody, for this presentation. All right, it is now my pleasure to welcome three of the four panelists. We have Miranda Huron from Capilano University, we have John Chenoweth from NVIT, and we have Jason La Rochelle from the Justice Institute of BC. Welcome, everybody. Right.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank
Dianne
you.
was not able to be with us today live, but we've got these three here, and we've got a number of questions in the chat. So just as a reminder to everybody online, please put your questions into the chat so that I can relay it to our guests. So the first question is from Samantha from Alexander College, who's asking, what post-secondary programs or courses would you like to see in post-secondary, especially in the colleges, to support the work of revitalizing languages? Or would physical space and language teacher support be most helpful? Maybe I'll start with you, John, what your thoughts are, and then we'll move around the room.
Well, I know that NVIT was part of this Indigenous Language Consortium probably 15 years ago. And the result of that was a creation of this language fluency framework. And I know that one of the intentions of that framework was that it's available for schools to use that want to follow this framework for language fluency. So it's, I don't know if I'll call it open source, but if people want it, we'll send them everything. That the medium of language is what's changed within the course outlines and the program guides. But I think for a start, for any schools hoping to delve into this area, work with your local First Nations, talk about, what do they need to help revitalize languages, and then determine what can we do as a college or institute or university to support that. So it's going to start with a conversation.
Jason, do you have any thoughts on what post-secondary programs or courses you'd like to see post-secondaries offer to help support language revitalization?
Yeah, I mean, I think John was covering some of the course part well, but I know that the second part of that question was also interesting in terms of like the supports for like even the physical space and of the teacher. And it does remind me, and I know that John brought it up in the session, but I think Miranda and Dianne did as well, in terms of like land-based education. So I think part of conceptualizing language programs and courses, regardless of institution, is thinking about the physical space in which those might be taking place, but what is the openness and willingness, or what plans might already be in play in terms of like land-based education. So I think it's not thinking along more traditional classroom lines, and if it inevitably does have to take place within a classroom, it's like, well, how can you modify those spaces so it doesn't feel like a certain kind of way? So I think that's not only in terms of considering how you support the language teacher within an institution, but also the learners. Because when I think about those language teachers that come in, some have gone through post-secondary themselves, but many are community-based. And when the traditional classroom structures really isn't kind of part of how they would, just from a pedagogical perspective, how they would teach, right? And it doesn't really, it's not as conducive to those structures. So I think it's maybe more about how can, rather than the community being forced to adapt, which I think is too common of a thing for institutions that advertently and inadvertently have. I think it's how can the institutions adapt to what the community needs and what the language speaker needs actually are.
Miranda, do you want to offer any insight as well?
Yeah, I mean, very comprehensive answers, but and also thinking about it, I think about there's both the sphere of all of the practical pieces that may not seem directly language related, learning those the archiving, the recording, the IT aspect of promoting languages that don't necessarily get recognized within this space, but also there's a whole sphere of learning that I have a lot of fear of us losing, and that's those technical knowledges around languages. So when we're thinking about when we think about the sciences, science has their own language, or office spaces have their own language. All of these specialized pieces of language that don't get covered in standard language classes necessarily, where you're learning the basics. Where are the spaces for us to learn that? So I think that's another priority.
Thanks, Miranda. I appreciate all your responses on this question. We have a couple more in the chat. This one's from Susan from TRU. What are your thoughts that, in addition to language, about also recognizing and credentialing community knowledges, ways of knowing, and worldviews for those communities that might want it? So that would include pedagogy as well as epistemology. Why don't we start with you, Miranda, and then we'll go backwards to Jason and John.
It's a complicated question. I don't know that there's really I would hesitate to put that in a credentialized area. That is something that belongs to nations to acknowledge their community members and those types of knowledge. And yeah, all of that would be case by case with nation, and if there's a reason that they would want to see it credentialized, and discussing what that looks like, because it just feels like a slippery slope to go down.
Okay, fair enough. Jason?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting consideration to like very encompassing and much along the lines of what Miranda has spoken to. Um, those relationships with the different communities, and I know John has examples to share as well. Like it inevitably there has to be flexibility to what their needs are, and some might want and have expressed wanting to have that recognition from a post-secondary institution or in the sector itself, and others not. No, it's not the same, but it's in the realm of like prior learning assessment approaches, uh, and kind of, and I guess it's not exactly the same, but it's considering it's looking outside of the box more, and tailoring it to not what the institution would deem as like this is a credential kind of part, but what the community would deem. And again, it's more like the institution looking for ways to make that work, because I think traditionally it's been the opposite, where institutions have been like, oh well, that doesn't fit what we currently have in our programming, or that doesn't fit articulation, it doesn't fit. We don't have a one-to-one transferability, and maybe it'll fit block transfer and so forth, right? And so that's more from an institutional lens. But what is the community's lens on that? And when they express that need, how can institutions pivot to meet that need and actually work with those institutions? So I think much like Miranda was saying, like that's going to look different, and I don't think there's going to be and there shouldn't be a template to just to use for that.
John, do you want to weigh in as well?
Sure. Could you say the question again, though, Michael?
Sure. So what are your thoughts that, in addition to language, about also recognizing and credentialing community knowledges, ways of knowing, and worldviews, including pedagogy and
Epistemologies.
epistemology?
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna take 15 seconds and say what an elder came into NVIT one time and said, "Do you want to know what you're doing wrong at NVIT?" We said, "Of course." And he said that you're not teaching our stories. And we delve deeper, and by stories, it's he said that's our jurisdiction, that's our ways of knowing, that's our our identity and everything, and it's connected to language. And I said, well, what do you think we're teaching? And he said, well, you're teaching a colonial view of Indians in this country. And that's how he talked, just verbatim. So if we think about like First Nation studies, Indigenous studies, we look at a colonial history of Canada with First Nations. And so I kind of scratch my head a little bit and go, So then how would we teach stories and get through that stuff? Well, we have to work with the communities so that we know they can sit back and smile and nod and go, yes, that's what we're talking about. And with our agreement with them to offer programs like that, we would never own the curriculum. So it could be credentialized, it could be articulated, but the curriculum belongs to the community that we develop it with. And we've got a few examples, actually many examples where we've done that, particularly in language. But we're a school that has a lot of Indigenous course credit, but a great proportion of that is through our agreements owned by the community, and that's how we navigate that one, and we will continue to do that.
Excellent. I've got one last question in the chat. This is from Stephanie Boychuk from Vancouver Island University. I'm just going to quote the question. I'm from the adult basic education side, and I'm wondering how we could better recognize language learning at that level so students learning language in their communities, not necessarily associated with the university program, could potentially get credit for that learning towards the BC adult graduation diploma. So maybe I'll start with you, Jason, since I've started with John and Miranda the last one. So do you have thoughts on that question?
No, fair enough. And my earlier roots around articulation was within adult basic education and articulating some of the courses to get the adult dogwood. And I think languages, especially at that time, again, it was trying to have them fit the system itself. And I think we have, we're not there, but the talks like today and the questions that are being asked, I think are showing where directions that we can go. And so thinking about the requirements for within adult basic education for the adult dogwood, and where can language be recognized officially, right, to meet those requirements, right? And not, sometimes it's electives and things along those kind of lines. But I think the more that it's available, especially at that level, to be able to get, and then it gets that recognition in terms of transferability as well, I think would help foster that. But it's gonna take institutions that are delivering adult basic education, and I know that there's the specific articulation tables to be able to to move that forward in recognition.
Miranda, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I feel like this is a space where organizations like FPCC can be really helpful in having done the sort of work with the community on their language programming and being able to speak to what community sees as being language learning, and then partnering in with schools, provinces, etc. But and Jason answered the question so well.
All right, and I'll give the last word to you, John.
Yeah, sure. I think I see three avenues for that. One is with actually developing, the province in the K-12 has a language framework for language from, I think it's 4 to 11. So that's one avenue an adult ed school center could look at, is seeing what they offer in grade 11. Now, for dual credit, you probably need an 060 or grade 12. So what we've done is we offer our first year 100 level credit to high schools and adult ed centers to use as the adult dogwood path to get their grade 12. And but we also have, we partner with schools like Ayala's, like the Anauken Center, that have actually created language at the 050, 060 level, which are the 11-12s. And other communities have followed suit, and we beg, borrow, steal ideas from our Ayala's, from other colleges, but there's a way to, the medium of language can be put into various different formats, and that's where we can share from each other. But if you have an adult ed center, I think offering language at that place is ideal, because identity is going to only strengthen a student's resolve to go on. So there are many different things you can do. If the, I'm sure you can contact any of us, and we can put you in touch with our folks that do that kind of thing on a regular basis. So.
Thank you so much, John, Jason, and Miranda, for joining us today. I think this was an excellent conversation. I really enjoyed it. As I mentioned off the top, I found myself reflecting a fair bit on this conversation after we did the recording, and it gives us a lot of different calls for action that I think that post-secondaries can take to help work towards preserving Indigenous languages in post-secondary. So thank you once again for joining us today at JAM 2025. We are going to take a quick 30-second break, and then we're going to set up the next session, which is called Increasing Student Pathways Through Micro-Credentials. We'll see you in about 30 seconds. Thank you.